This is the delayed Town of New Canaan Affordable Housing Committee, no longer in the Town Hall meeting room, now in the boardroom. Regular meeting Monday, July 8th, 2024, 7 p.m. Let's do roll call. Chris Wilson, I see you on Zoom.
Here.
Krista Nielsen.
Here.
Jane Williams.
Here.
Bill Perrette.
Here.
Mike Sweeney. Here. Maria Weingarten.
Here.
Jeff Williams. Hillary Ormond. John Goodwin. I am here. Okay. Next item, I would like to amend the agenda. I would like a motion to amend the agenda to add item 3A, brief on Westcog Affordable Housing Finance Study. Francis Pickering, Executive Director. Do I have a motion? Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, so we had Jane, we had Jeff, all those in favor? Okay, perfect. Okay, let's go to the minutes. Item number 2, approval of minutes, the meeting held on June 10, 2024. Everybody okay with the minutes? Everybody okay?
Yeah.
Okay, do I have a motion for approval?
Motion.
Krista Nielsen, Bill Perrette on the second, all those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, super. Okay, let's start with Steve Kleppen. As I mentioned before we started recording, I had the pleasure of working with Steve for a number of years on planning and zoning. One of the great things about Steve was very, very good planner, but also I found Steve always had a lot of great ideas. You're always thinking forward. You weren't afraid to put out ideas out there, weren't be afraid to have yourself yelled at for some of those ideas.
I attract that, yes.
What's that, Steve?
I attract that.
But, and now, as you all know, Steve is the Director of Planning and Zoning in Norwalk. Steve, we gave you a little bit of a brief. We're still, as you know, our mission as a subcommittee is to achieve moratoriums. We, as always, we have moving parts, but we believe that our near-term goal within the next 4 years or so is probably a relatively low bar for additional affordable housing units. Call it, 20 units or so. If you guys all agree, that's the right ballpark. And then 8 years or so from now, we'd have an additional goal of, call it 40 to 50 units. So that's how we're starting to think about it. We have 2 subcommittees. One is looking at financing. How do we finance things? All the way from what's the town's role to financing methods, affordable housing. You well know our affordable housing fund. And then our second project subcommittee is our project subcommittee, where we're looking at sites, and led by Krista Nielsen on my right. And so we've been looking at sites around town, and thinking about, what are the criteria for those sites? How do we think about the process of analyzing those sites? And also, how do we think about, communicating with the town? So what I thought I was thinking about perhaps, you helping us, one as a planner, just, telling us how you would think about doing this process. How would you think about site identification? What are the criteria? And then given your experience in the town, I would also love to hear, thoughts you may have, and we may throw some site ideas at you to, get some reactions. But how would you think about the process?
Well, a couple of things without refamiliarizing myself. Without refamiliarizing myself with the framework.
Bob, can you mute everybody, please?
Yeah, so for like the housing unit equivalency points and those things, I haven't looked at those in a long time. Thankfully, I don't have to deal with that anymore. But I think if you have, this is going to be an ongoing issue for you guys to try to do that. And then I think the goals should, I understand your goal is to avoid 830G applications when you can. But if you have a goal of trying to add affordable housing at the same time, that definitely fits a need. That probably is a good 2-pronged approach. You have, the sites you and I spoke a little briefly earlier, you have the lumberyard lot, you have the Locust
Yeah.
Street or Locust Avenue lot. I mean, those are two assets right downtown that, it's good that they provide parking, but they're two pretty large sites that don't do much else that could be repurposed, obviously, for something else. You could establish the criteria you wanted to see on those sites with how tall someone could build, how dense they could build, what level of affordability you would want in that development. You could put all kinds of criteria on the type of development, whether it was, the level of green infrastructure or sustainability criteria in the construction. You could do all that, wrap that into an RFP and then put it out to bid. And that way you control the process. And then you guys have a lot of smart finance people here that could figure out how that's handled process wise. But I think, the other part of that is you get one crack at it. So you better make sure you have everything you want on your wish list first. We've done that in Norwalk, a couple of different properties and how we kind of public-private partnership development. So I think it's a good model. I would also recommend not just doing a solely affordable process. I would do it mixed use. I mean, there's a lot of research that's been done that shows that those models, it's just better from a societal point of view, that just like segregating one group of folks at a certain income level. And you could also do different income levels. It could be market, hit your 830G, you could do a lower one. You could do different points for different formulas and makeup of how that's all put together. So there's a lot of different options that way to go about that. And some of it's really your comfort level with things too, what the public says. I would definitely recommend, if you do go that route, pretty pictures help. So if everybody knows what the lumberyard looks like, but I mean, it's a pretty, you could definitely design it in a way with the way it's so much higher. I'm forgetting this. Elm Street, yeah, the northern street versus Pine Street, right? Yeah, thanks. So there's a big grade change there. So you could do it in a way that wouldn't overwhelm Pine Street and wouldn't kind of ruin the aesthetic. I mean, I always thought that's just kind of a black hole sitting there by itself. It's considering it's, next to the train station, super valuable real estate. And there's always going to be a housing crisis. Doesn't seem like it's going away. So you have a lot to think about on that front. And if you have any questions on that piece of it.
How would you think about the addition to density of, say, a lumberyard?
Well, I have to take, I mean, I'm sure somebody's done the math, what your existing zoning would allow there.
Yeah.
What would you get it to a comfort level? I mean, it's your asset, so you control whether you sell it or do anything with it, or you maintain it, however you process that. You could I know you went through a pretty extensive read of your affordable housing regs to provide bonuses and different things. So you could see how applying those would benefit the project and map it out so that you have those options that are available. You could, again, that's a lot of comfort level with the residents, especially you're selling a city asset or you're leasing a city asset. People are going to push back at some level. So you got to be able to justify it. And like I said, pretty pictures help. And, you can also definitely look at it from an economic standpoint too, because you can say right now we have this parking lot that you're going to, I don't know if you still have a wait list for parking spaces, if that's dropped based on.
It's dropped, but it sounds like we still do.
Yeah, so you
2
can.
years instead of 7.
Yeah, so you definitely you want to maintain X number of parking spaces or increase it X, because maybe they can excavate and add some, you can do a lot of different things. Look at below grade parking go down a level, different ways to do that. You'd write in that you want to maintain and how many number of spaces are there or increase it by X spaces, plus provide one parking space per unit or whatever you think is the appropriate number. My guess is there will be a lot of overlap between people parking there for daytime versus overnight. So lots of different ways to write the code or write the formula how you'd want to see it.
Steve, would you go so far as to sort of work with an architect to have the town conceptually design what it would want to see on, say, that site or Locust or any of the parking lots?
I definitely would.
So then you kind of know exactly what you want to put in the RFP as opposed to coming up with some criteria and then seeing what comes back in the RFP may not be anything
Yeah.
you want.
And there's a lot of, we're actually looking at software now. There's a lot of GIS software now where you can block model stuff pretty easily. Well, like it basically takes your zoning code and builds it. And then you could tweak it to, if say you change the height by a story or you double the density, it'll model that for you. And then you could make it, somebody can make it look pretty. So then people will know what you're talking about. I think if you just tell them numbers, they're going to get scared. It's going to seem so different for them. It changes. We were talking about this earlier. People hate change. They want things to change and improve, but they don't want the actual change. So it's like, without showing them, you're going to have a tougher argument.
Do you have advice in just that subject of how to bring the town along in whatever projects we end up deciding we want to put in front of them for consideration?
I got to be honest, that's not my strong suit. I usually, a lot of times kicking and screaming with certain changes with zoning, because sometimes you just, if people are very dug in on their opinions, sometimes it's really hard to move them. I try my best to listen, but I mean, I always go with what I think is what's best for the community, and I stick to that. Try to make my arguments with as much data as I can. I don't always win those arguments, but I mean, the other thing I was thinking about, what you could look at, in addition to the bigger projects, I think you could look at, and I didn't get a chance to look at the zoning map. I wanted to do that before we met. Where could you loosen up just within, and I would base it on a rational discussion of proximity to your downtown and the train station. Where could you loosen up the single family zoning to add 2-family or 3-family or 4-family, and then have an affordability component in that? I think there's a lot of good examples of, and I think in the Westcog study even talks about little cottage communities. Planners are really bad about using those little buzzwords that after a while make people angry and usually cause fights, but they show pictures that indicate what that actually looks like, and you can have nice little communities. There's a couple examples in New Canaan too that I remember that were done pretty well. So you can cluster things in a small manner. Just got to pick the right spots, so you're not going to go too far away from the downtown to hurt your argument about like walkability or access to the downtown and services and the train station, but close enough where it's like you're not completely changing things too much.
So on that note, we just had a subcommittee meeting before this meeting where we were talking about some potential sites and kind of discussing, we did some research. I'm sure you're very familiar with most of these sites. They're all the usual suspects, the Lumberyard, Locust, Morse Court, this parking lot up here behind us, Canaan Park, the intersection there across from where Mrs. Green's was, at the post office. But one that is still on our list that's kind of out of the usual, well, it's still usually usual suspect, but out of the downtown core is the mulch pile. And what are your thoughts, across from Waveney Park, the leaf pile down Latham Road?
I don't know. I have to think about that one a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, we were like, this one's different because you could do a fully almost contained affordable housing community, but it doesn't. Then the downside is that it's not walkable necessarily to downtown, but there's a lot more land over there that you could kind of create a whole new situation. I was just curious if you had thoughts about.
No, that's an interesting idea. I hadn't really thought about that one for development. The other thing I didn't mention, those you guys have to deal with, and one of my former coworkers is a planner in Wilton now, and they're getting a lot of apartments along Route 7, and they're actually seeing, I mean, the concern there would be increased school kids. I know that'll come up. So you'd have to factor that in, how you handle your bedroom breakdown. But I think, that it's not all a bad thing either. So kind of other things. I think the other thing I would definitely do, if circling back on the downtown lots, is really look at the tax benefit analysis from it. I mean, you have the parking lot that's generating, whatever revenue you get from the parking now, but if you maintain that revenue plus add the tax you're going to get from 150 new units plus whatever else gets built there, that's probably a pretty significant amount of money, I would think, based on commercial real estate values you have downtown.
Did you look at developing I heard of the rumor saying, but it's developing a lumberyard.
We looked at what you could do there. Yeah, I didn't, not me, no, I don't develop anything. But we did talk about the Locust Ave lot, we talked about, we actually did even up the parking lot here a couple different times. We did test borings. I think the data was with Public Works, so we know where you could go and where you could dig down and what was an impediment and not an impediment. Morris Court's another interesting site. It's a little smaller and a little more compact, but I mean, it's like you've got these great streets, but then you have these massive parking lots, like even like where out in front of other side of Morris Court along, I think it's Cross Street. No, not Cross Street, Cherry Street,
Sure.
where
Yeah.
in front of the opposite from the church behind Bob's is you have that kind of, it's so walkable until you get there and it's kind of this blank area of nothing where you could fill that in with, it would just look a lot different. So there's a lot of options with things.
Morse, so do you think that's a viable site?
I think you'd have to, that's one you'd want to sit down with an architect and have them kind of say, what could you do here?
Mhm.
That's, I mean, I know we looked at it from parking deck expansion standpoint, but I'm sure it could be developed too. But and then again, to do those things, you have to look at what you're going to require for parking, because that's going to eat up land. And then what's your appetite for height? Because that's another thing
Yeah.
that's,
Well, we talk about that, Morse has 5 or 6 feet lift on the Main Street side. Did you ever think about taking that out altogether and bringing the building down to the sidewalk level?
I don't know if we looked at it to that detail, and I don't remember looking at it for housing specific. I know we looked at it for a parking deck at one point in time, and I can't remember if we put that in as like, could somebody develop it in conjunction with that?
Thank you.
Steve, what is, so let's say let's talk about parking per unit, which as you remember is an ongoing debate in New Canaan. I mean, how would you, let's say the project is within walking, it's TOD, it's within walking distance of the railroad, it's, adjacent to the town. How would you think about number of parking spaces per certain number of bedrooms or units?
Yeah, I mean, your primary doesn't require any parking right now. So there's different ways you control developments, the density number, the height, parking. You also could FAR it, which, we kind of got where I work now. We don't do FAR anymore. We got rid of it.
Yeah.
What's that?
Floor area ratio, it's kind of like how much volume you can add on a property in comparison to lot area. It's kind of an outdated metric, but still required in a lot of places. I mean, in Norwalk, we just eliminated our parking requirement in our whole downtown area. It's not, everybody's thrilled with that new rule, but we haven't seen it play out yet. And the developers we talked to said they're still going to provide some parking because people are still driving. And sometimes they can't get financing without some parking. I mean, I could say if you develop like the lumberyard lot, in addition to whatever public parking you provided, I couldn't see requiring more than one space per unit.
Yeah, because that's a big footprint, and I think right now there's 298 spaces that are dedicated,
Sounds right. Yeah.
permitted, so we would have to, assuming we would do, still provide that, and then want to provide for anything that was developed there. It's a lot.
Yeah, and
It's a
if,
big deck.
yeah, you're gonna deck it, then that means you have to, if you want the unit density, you're gonna have to go up even further plus the deck. And if you want somebody to go down, that structured parking's, 50, 60,000 a space, whereas a deck's probably 30, 35. So you're just adding cost. If you go below grade
Oh,
and
it's
then
50 to 60
Yeah.
per space,
Yeah.
below grade, but if you're just decking up.
it's probably 30, 35. And this is the last time we priced anything, as it could be, who knows? And the prefab now is a little cheaper than it used to be with just building on site.
That's helpful to know.
Question, has Norwalk had any situation where they've asked the state to provide some state-owned land for you guys to develop projects?
Yeah, we've had like, when there's residual state property, we've talked to them, because sometimes there's like right of way that they, where the 7 connector, for example, we've taken some small pieces there. Actually, they've sold off some to some different developers as well for projects, because they need money, and then it's land they're never going to use. They've done that as well.
Because we're thinking about this, one of the other options we were looking at was where the old post office used to be. And behind it, that's the state-owned lot, parking lot there on the, right next to the train station on both sides.
Okay.
So the thought is that on the south side of the train tracks, you could potentially put some sort of a smaller affordable housing development over there. Maybe have retail, mixed use below.
Yep.
And, but the thing, we'd have to go talk to the state about it. So I was just wondering if the state had given you any land, if you were trying to.
Yeah, I don't know their, you know, and there's been a lot of turnover at the state, so it's harder to say what their philosophy is. I know that they don't like to give up parking, but I think they're okay if somebody else manages it. I've seen that in different spots, but I'm not sure if I'm the best person to talk to about that.
Steve, let's go back to where you're talking about, we're calling it small ball, but talk a little more detail about if we were to say, and one of the questions is, do we try to identify specific, I'm talking about smaller developments, you know, within the town footprint, maybe it's smaller single family homes that can be put into, you know, somewhat larger footprint or rehab or something like that. But, you know, how would you think about doing that? Would you literally try to identify properties, or would you sort of lay out the criteria, try to identify, for lack of a better term, zones, and would you do P and Z regulations to, you know, motivate? How would, give us more detail how you think about that?
So I think you'd have to probably, you could do a couple different things. I think you, probably start big picture, like top-down view of like a half mile from the downtown. Just, I'm throwing that out there. I don't know if that's the right number or not. But
Yeah.
then you draw that circle and then look at what the neighborhoods are that are within that circle. And then you're going to rule out some right away because it's just not going to make sense, or you know it's going to be a fight you're not going to win. So you probably would take that stuff right out of the conversation. Then you tighten the circle a little bit and then look at, are there streets, I mean, you don't want to do it on you could do it on a case by case basis with some kind of floating zone or an overlay zone or something, but I think that would get kind of messy. It'd be better to kind of think about rezoning a street or a block or something like that, to either look at the existing zones you have or create a new zone that you could do. But just, there's different ways to start doing that.
And then would you write into those zones specific regulations motivating developers, enabling, you know, whether it's additional density?
Yeah, so if you took, just hypothetically, if you took like a 15 or 20,000 square foot lot, and then where somebody could only do a single family today, but you'd let them do like a 3 or 4 units on that lot, and in some kind of fashion with specific design criteria.
Yeah.
You could lay all that out and with pictures and say, this is how it had to get developed. And you could say 2 of the units had to be deed restricted affordable, and then 2 could be marked. You know, there's different ways you could slice it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there trends you're seeing in affordable housing development that we ought to be aware of?
You know, I think, and when I looked at the Westcox report, it's, and the recommendations are all fine. And then we're just in the process of doing our separate report now. And some of the recommendations overlap, and I'm seeing that with a lot of stuff. It's every planning study, regardless of the topic, there's a lot of overlap with different recommendations. And it's not like the ideas are bad, or it's just that they're all kind of a lot of the same thing. And because there are only so many tools that work. I mean, the inclusionary zoning is a good tool, but if you're not building a lot of multifamily, you're not going to really make much of a dent. Plus, you're probably not going to catch up to that number. You're adding market rate at the same time you're adding the affordable units, so you're not really changing the equation at all. So it's good to do, but it's not, I don't think, if you're worried about the moratorium points, it's probably not going to get you to that level. I think you have to do multiple things. But I mean, I think it was a credit Laszlo Papa and Glenn Shalder who looked at the Affordable Housing Fund, which was a you know,
Mhm.
did great things. So that's a, good model. I stole it and brought it with me too, so.
And going, then going back to looking at the larger sites. So how would you sequence that? So the project subcommittee has a list of 7 or 8, 7 sites. They've done analysis. Is the next step to bring in, say, an architect to create the pretty pictures? Or, I mean, how would you, and, I think it was agreed tonight, I left a little bit early, but we're going to talk more about, more criteria. But, how would you sequence that process?
So I guess the first question would be, would you pursue multiple and then like do that on multiple just to show everybody options? Or would you just say, here's the preferred one because of X, Y, and Z?
I don't know, but I think that we're talking about having some sort of public meeting in the fall where some of these things get presented. So I think at that time, we'd still want to present multiple options, because I think anytime you kind of narrow it down too far, people say, well, what about this? What about that one? So like, we haven't said exactly how many options. We talked about trying to get it to 4, 3 to 5, somewhere like that tonight, and then go into more detail on the pros and cons of each site.
Yeah.
And bring in an architect to do the pretty pictures and do some cost estimates so that we can start to weigh that. Cost obviously is a factor as well into our calculations.
Yeah, and I would also say if your goal is to get those housing unit equivalency points, you could lay that out as a matrix. You could also lay out the tax benefits of doing this, the aesthetics and those things. The only thing I was just thinking about when you're talking about the public meeting was, if you remember, when they talked about the plan I think they were going to move City Hall to the police station, and they had Jeb Walker was first selectman.
I was
When
gonna say, we had a whole thing about the police station a couple of years ago.
this was, yeah, remember?
This was
that?
It was a different
Earlier,
version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that blew up pretty quickly, and then they did a building committee afterwards to try to. So I would just try to remember those lessons. So, you don't want to repeat that because that didn't end up well.
But the thing I remember too was not only Board of Ed at Waveney, but again, you were trying to be prescient and look forward, and you were working on Zone D over at Road Street, and trying to think through what could be done there. And I remember the hearing, I think it was downstairs in the old town hall, and people were all ripped up because they didn't really understand what we were trying to do.
Yeah.
So we were talking about that tonight. How do we message? And I think this time our point of departure is different. The point of departure isn't what do we want to do here to maybe have more development here. I think our point of departure is we have a problem we're trying to solve. It's got to be solved, and here's the alternative. So it's not a yes or no binary question. It's the answer. I think it should be presented as it's yes, we got to do this, but help us find where and how to do it. So I think it might be a little bit different than what we encountered maybe in Zone D. But we had someone speak to us one night about the presentation, putting together those you had done bulk plans at that point, what it might look like, and having people be able to drop balls into a bucket or something like that, and what their preferences were. Got some good ideas on that. So might not be, what you encountered, when you did the Grove Street thing, hopefully.
Yeah.
I think it's also a timing issue because, we're hopefully, kind of knock on wood, as we're trying to get toward our moratorium. We're looking to get to a faster moratorium for the one after this one. So the thought being that we only need about 20 viewpoints or so to get there. So the thought is that if there's something that, because those larger projects obviously are much more involved, much more financing and everything. So, I think it just depends on what we can do more quickly, because that clock starts rolling at some point. We have 4 years to come up with our next moratorium.
Yeah, the other thing to think about, and just thought of traffic too, what if you added 200 units at the lumberyard lot, what is traffic going to look like? So you might decide, that's not cheap to run a traffic study for that too. So you have to think about that, but someone's gonna ask,
Right.
it will come up for sure.
So you would think about some top level traffic study before you went into a community session?
Yeah, I would, because I think there's gonna be somebody that's against it for some reason. They'll cite traffic.
So what would you look for us to have done before we walk into a community session?
Well, that's the tricky thing too, when you have multiple options, because if multiple options, if you're running the same analysis for multiple sites, it get really costly.
Mhm.
So I don't know what your budget is for that kind of stuff.
It's zero.
Right now.
It's zero.
Yeah, I mean, to do like, the architectural modeling stuff is really not that expensive. It's not as bad as, I think the traffic study would, if you
Yeah.
did a real traffic study, it
Yeah.
would be, and I don't know if there's been enough projects done around downtown where somebody could pull those
Yeah.
together and the data's still viable, that they could kind of piece stuff together.
Yeah, I'm not sure for example, those of you who know Mike Galante, you knew Mike, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Mike was he was the axe in traffic studies in New Canaan. Since I stepped down from being, is he still the axe in New Canaan?
Does he work at?
I think he's retired.
Retired.
Yeah.
Oh, Mike retired?
No, we haven't.
Okay, well, maybe
There's someone
he
else
needs a
that's-
little consulting gig.
There you go.
But my point being is, I last worked with Mike on the library, which was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it was. And, the benefit of somebody like Mike in traffic was, yeah, Mike could talk to you off the top of his head about various projects around this town, and he could give you a ballpark. So, I mean, we probably would want to,
Yeah, do that beforehand.
yeah.
And impact on schools as well, because that seems like the other obvious thing people. will
Yeah, that'll
bring up.
come up. You can control that somewhat with the bedroom count a little bit, but you gotta,
Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but the need that's been identified by the housing authority is 2 and 3 bed, larger units.
we're seeing it 2-bedroom too, from even more than 3, but 2 is a big one that comes up, but 3 bedrooms for sure. Yeah, both of them come up.
And it might be woven into the school discussion. There's already, setting aside any development we might do, there's already a conversation about a kindergarten move. So the Board of Ed is going to have to make some decisions in the next year or two, perhaps. I don't know if they're considering rezoning the schools or if they're considering building on one or the other,
Redistricting, yeah.
but that's, so it might be, I want to say nice, but it could be convenient for us too, to weave this in and say, okay, how should that factor into where we're considering building? Because we do want to meet the need. We don't want to just put up a building that's full of 1-bedrooms and not meet the need in our.
Check the
community.
Hue Point box.
Just because we don't want to, I can't envision anything even at the lumberyard overwhelming a school. And but I hear that, I hear the community
Yes.
worried about that. So I do think that there's a point to articulate what the actual impact would be.
Mhm.
And it's priced for how many kids before you need another teacher, before you need another.
Sure,
I think it's pretty easy formula probably for whoever knows it. For 6 different projects, but.
Yeah.
Be nice to have some ballpark answers.
Yeah.
Can you get ballpark answers on parking? Or do you have to do it in depth?
What do you mean
Traffic.
Sorry, yeah, traffic study.
I think you
Well,
probably can.
Galante was still around, the answer would be ballpark. I'm sure
Anyone
yeah.
who does that work day in and day out
Yeah.
can look at a site and give you some idea.
Yeah.
I mean, whether.
Yeah, I think we could get top level.
Yeah, I mean, you can do,
But to Jane's point, I think schools are going to be a lot easier to estimate than traffic. Traffic is a more complicated subject.
We have data from the housing authority too on kids and.
On
On schools, yeah. And Steve, quick question.
Can I ask Steve a question?
Go ahead, Bill.
Earlier you were talking about the lumberyard site and you were talking about, sort of a plan for the site itself and what type of use you would put there. But when you look at that whole area of town, ranging from where the supermarket is currently called Acme, all the way down to the end of the trade station, and then you look at the other side of Elm Street as well. One might think about a grander plan, very much like, Norwalk has done in some of their areas. How should we be thinking about that as a town, just as the lumberyard by itself? What about the adjacent land?
Well, I mean, I think you'd have to, if you wanted to, when you talk about adjacent land, I mean, it's kind of like a rectangle, right? The lumberyard lot's kind of a rectangle by itself, more or less.
Well, it is, but some of the, even if you go down further, there's a former bank that's been sitting there vacant for a while. I guess someone's gonna go in there. But even the Acme is old and probably needs to be redone. I mean, it's probably a whole redevelopment that could be done in that section if you looked at it in a grand plan standpoint. Maybe not. Maybe, maybe you just do it one parcel at a time, but it seemed to me to be a lot more that could be done there.
Yeah, I mean, the other part of it too is if you did have a shiny new development in the lumberyard lot's a big piece, so that might, another thing to think about, is that too big to start with there,
Yeah.
if you're worried about public buy-in to something. If you did, had the shiny new development where the lumberyard lot is, I think that is going to increase property values in and around there, and that the market might take care of itself at that point too. I'm not positive about that, but it very well could. The Locust lot, at least I think there's some projects approved
Yeah,
behind there too.
yeah, they're being constructed right
And
now.
down below where the post office is now. And
Mhm.
so there's already been change in that area, and it's kind of tucked in. So it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind, unless you're going to a restaurant or something down there. If there was a nice building there versus a parking lot, I don't think people would get too upset by it. It shouldn't be a big lift with something like that. There's a lot of ways, they could wrap the parking's all tucked behind there, so you don't lose any parking, and the building kind of wraps the streets and fills in really nice. It's pretty easy to do. But you have to have enough. If it's going to be without the density and the height, it's tough to get, the numbers to work too for somebody. Yeah, that's what you got to talk to.
Yeah.
The architect might be able to help with something like that.
Chris Wilson, any questions at your end? Please. Is Chris still on, Bob?
I am, no questions.
Okay.
I do have a question. So, how about home ownership? I mean, it's something we never hear about, and it's really kind of concerning to me that we don't really think about, creating generational wealth, and it's just more rental development.
That is the hardest part that I don't think anybody's come up with a good answer, because I know we have some that started out as affordable, they're co-ops, I guess, but they're restricted. They're restricted at the cap. So you don't really build that wealth anyway. So I haven't seen that model. There are Hertford's doing something new. I read, I'll have to dig that article out, but I don't know how viable it is, but I know they're trying a couple different, there's a specific term for it that I'm misremembering right now. So I'll have to find that. I can send it on, but that's been a challenge.
Are you talking about the workforce housing or?
I don't remember the name.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that's come up a lot in Norwalk is
That's my question has anything been done in Norwalk on that? front?
not on for sale units, that like the inclusionary zoning we have works much better with rental. It's just it's easy for us to monitor, and we have several hundred units that we monitor that they have to give us annual compliance with, and forms and paperwork, and we have to file with the state.
When you say we in Norwalk, like, do you have your housing authority do that, or?
No, my staff does.
Okay.
Just because the housing authority manages their projects, and then we have the workforce units that are the inclusionary zoning units. So we have, every project's got to give at least 10%,
Okay.
which seems to be a pretty good number.
Workforce.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what we call our workforce housing, but it's kind of like it's the 830G compliant housing.
It is big there.
Yeah.
So it's below 80% of
80% of area AMI.
No, we use SMI, we use 80 and 60. So we have two different formulas. If you do 80%, you also have to give us the inclusionary zoning fee, which is the same fee you have, or you can do 60% SMI. Most people do.
So why do you call it workforce?
That's what it was geared towards when it was built, to provide workforce housing for teachers and
Oh, okay.
that. And that's really the segment that it serves. We're finding our real need is much below that, like the populace that really needs help is there's the lowest level where they're getting a lot of vouchers and section 8, and then we're kind of it's that next group that we're seeming to have trouble getting to the next level. That's what we're kind of trying to focus on.
Got it.
And that's the tricky part about parking too, because I think when you're trying to do a mixed development here, you're gonna need to, like, you probably will need 2 cars. You know what I mean? Like, so even if you're in downtown and, you know, if you have a 2-bedroom, probably need 2 cars. I just don't see that many people not needing a car here. So if you're doing it inclusionary, I think it's still hard to kind of cut out all the parking because.
Yeah, you have to, that's something you could write whatever code or whatever you wanted to do for kind of like your scope, that they have to, you could put a max on the parking and a min on the parking too, if what you were comfortable with.
That was one part of Jeff Speck's presentation that I wasn't sure about, because he said, you can do this with 0 to 1 parking spaces. I can't see that here.
No,
It reminds me of that movie Singles, where he was like their cars.
Yeah.
Like you try to build a train, or, I mean, obviously that's different when going into the city, but a lot of people it's hard to give up to not have a car.
well,
here.
the
very
schools
hard.
are not right in the downtown.
Yeah,
You know, your kid's sick, you gotta go get your kid.
yeah.
And we don't have any other public transit
Right.
besides the train.
Yeah, Millport was done, 1-for-1, 1 unit parking. And it's tight. It's one of the biggest complaints, there's parking.
Yeah.
Everyone wants 2 cars.
Yeah.
I know we're not right downtown, but I think even if it were to be downtown,
Still need
people aren't hopping on the train, they still want to drive to work, and unless they're working in town.
To get to the doctor's office, to your point.
Home
Yeah.
Depot after
No
school
way to-
activities, anything. Yeah.
Friend's house for dinner.
I had a
Steve.
question about, I'm sorry. Jim.
Okay, well, real quick, Steve, so let's say it was a mixed income project. What range would you think of being affordable?
Oh, the percent?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. I'm trying to think of the couple of projects we did. That the more affordability you build into it, though, the more market rate units you need to cover the cost. So that's the other part of it.
Right. Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
No. I was thinking through what you were talking about, I think to John or Krista's question about trying to pick up units around downtown in the existing zones. So if you don't like the floating zone where you kind of spell it out and see if it would land on a property, it means that you have to look at like a B zone or the apartment zone. And for example, now there's, or if I'm not quote it correctly, but if you have like 10 or 12,000 square feet, you can get like an accessory unit. So what you would do is you tweak those zones that if you had a lot of a certain size, or if you assembled 2 properties together, you could get 4 units just under the existing code. By way of special permit, maybe, that type of approach. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, you could do that for sure. I mean, the other part of it too, that comes into discussions with trying to build affordable housing is not requiring special permits just because it's cost, time, all those kind of things. So that's where you'd have to, if you could get everybody on board with not requiring the special permit, you'd have to have some really good standards in place that were you kind of comfortable with just a permit or however you wanted to do it.
Yeah, you'd have to maybe do a study, maybe to see if there was a pocket in town somewhere where that would work, because right now we have some beautiful single family homes, that like the next to a 2-family next to a 12,000 square foot lot where you could do a tear down on, or maybe a 4-unit project could go up. And maybe we want that, but there probably would be some raised eyebrows about that, doing that kind of change to the regs.
Yeah, that's why I would start high level and then see where you might be able to. And you could work with the assessor's office too, maybe to see where there's a large area of rentals now that might get less pushback, if that's something you'd try to like a beta test or something.
And we just kill the naturally occurring affordable.
Or protect it. I mean, we
Well,
could use
yeah.
zoning to protect it. That's one
Yeah.
of my thoughts in terms of small ball is identify where our naturally occurring affordable housing is. Target it if we're looking to do piecemeal acquisitions to deed restrict and put them back in the market. And then reduce the development potential of those sites so that they're not constantly under pressure for tear down rebuild.
Hmm. Has anything happened with the Cross and Beatty Street properties down there that seem to
Oh,
be?
still for sale.
Studies on the shelf.
Yeah, I guess so, huh? But that
Anybody
might be
else for
something to
Steve?
revisit
Sorry.
too. I was saying you could revisit that. Is there something you could kind of incentivize somebody to do something that?
Yeah,
Does
that would
Nor-
be another, I mean, that would be on the magnitude of the RR lot.
Yeah.
So, right.
There's another program where you can, so if someone's got a home and they need help with like their furnace breaks or they have to get, their roof has to get repaired and I know sometimes there's a way of doing that, to give project financing and give them like a 10-year forgivable loan if they have to do these things. And then that also goes towards your 10% number, but not towards your moratorium kind of thing. But has Norwalk done anything like that?
Yeah,
You
we
guys
we
do any of
do, we have actually a redevelopment agency too, and they do give out grants for facade improvement grants and those kind of things to help restore. And it's targeted in very specific areas. So we do that as well. There's some requirements on what they can do to the
Are
property.
they using CDBG,
Yeah,
What's that?
Community Development Block Grants
Oh,
from
okay.
HUD?
Got it.
Which comes already with income restrictions in terms of who you can lend to and areas that you can lend in.
Yeah,
But New Canaan is not
not gonna qualify.
an entitlement community. We don't get CDBG.
you'd have to fund that yourself.
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Your own program.
Anybody else for Steve? Steve, thank you so
Thank you
much.
so
You're welcome.
Okay.
Sure.
Get home safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
Thanks.
do we have Francis Pickering on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. Okay, Francis, let me announce you. Item 3A, probably violate Robert's Rules of Order, but whatever. Brief on West Cog Affordable Housing Finance Study, Francis Pickering, Executive Director. Francis, thank you so much for making yourself available on short notice. I was able to read the executive summary. I think some of us have been able to read parts of the report. But maybe if you don't mind, maybe giving us a summary, some of the key points, and you probably remember our discussion in the winter and some of the objectives that we're pursuing. So obviously, we're very interested to hear your thoughts about how your report can help us in our efforts.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me tonight. And I can't actually see you up close. So if you won't notice any, 1 second, the dog is squeaking.
I'm glad that happens to other people.
Okay, he does not like not being the center of attention, so he is now barred from the room. Okay, so yeah, so he just opened the door. Anyway, he about a year and a half ago, we commissioned this study, which you see before you. It's a pretty comprehensive study. It represents over $300,000 in the commitment of COG funds to this project. And we think it's the first of its type in the state. And the question we were seeking to ask, well, we've heard many times that municipalities cannot reach the 10% or a moratorium. And that the challenge has been that these statements really haven't been backed up by anything, right? So while they may be true, they're also viewed with skepticism. So we went to bid, and we contract with Goldman in New York to do a couple things. And there are more deliverables coming from this. There will be an interactive tool that municipalities can use to model different development scenarios towards getting to the 10% and or moratorium. But when we commissioned the study, we asked two questions. Was one, is it realistic to get to the 10% or a moratorium? And two, if so, what is the most cost-effective way to get there, given that public resources are limited? I'm not going to bore you with all 171 pages, but I'll probably talk about a couple of highlights. So the first thing that we find is that municipalities largely can get a moratorium or get to the 10%. They have not been taking advantage of all options under 830G, but it's not going to be easy because what we've heard a lot about in the last couple of years is zoning. Zoning reform has been, there have been pushes for that at the national and state level. And what the study concludes is that that is not going to get you there. The cost of construction just has risen so much faster than incomes have, that it really is not going to pencil out if we're trying to reach 10% or a moratorium through zoning reform, through inclusionary zoning. And what's interesting is when you look at the state as a whole, we have municipalities that have no shortage of land that is developable, have no shortage of land that is affordable. We have a couple that have no zoning at all, and they have not reached the 10%. And that is because of development pressure simply not being there. There is no interest from developers to build 830G compliant housing in those municipalities. What really is driving housing prices is not the zoning, it is market fundamentals. Are you in a relatively close distance of employment centers? And the solutions to getting a moratorium and to the 10% are going to vary based upon where you are in the state, and they're going to vary quite dramatically. And in some areas, it may require a good degree of coasting to get developers there. So looking at a town like New Canaan, if you look at the pro formas we have in the back of this, we've modeled out a few things. We haven't modeled out every scenario, but we've largely found that with obviously single family home development market rate generally pencils out. We see a lot of that, although prices have risen. If we're looking at larger multifamily housing development, if you are building to 30% of the units being affordable at 60 and 80% split in half of state median income, that's not going to pencil out. We don't see a lot of projects going through the affordable housing appeals process simply because the return on investment is not there for a developer. For those projects to pencil out, it is going to have to go above and beyond the appeals process and be sweetened by some level of government, whether it's state or local, a significant degree of subsidy, which could also be a tax expenditure, like a waiver of permitting fees. When looking at projects that will pencil out without public assistance, we really only find two types. One is accessory dwelling units or accessory apartments, especially when that's located inside an existing structure, because the structure is already there. Really, it's just a renovation project. The challenge with that is that the property owner wants to have to share his or her home with somebody else. They want to be a landlord, and that does not describe a large number of households, especially those who have chosen to live in single-family homes. They may appreciate their privacy and not having the headaches of being a landlord more than the additional revenue they could get from being a landlord. So those can pencil out, and they are more affordable. They probably will never be deed restricted because nobody wants to encumber the property that way. But those are one type of more affordable housing unit that does pencil out. The other one that does pencil out without public subsidy is, in some cases, not every case, often not in the case of a brownfield, although I believe you only have one listed potential brownfield in the town of New Canaan, is the conversion of other structures to multifamily housing. There are two types there. One is the one we talked about more in recent years with the nationwide collapse of the commercial sector, commercial real estate, that is the conversion of commercial buildings to multifamily housing. So that could be a good option. That really, of course, depends upon what your local commercial real estate market looks like and what every building looks like. If you have a large modern office building, of which probably don't have many, those don't lend themselves just due to the large floor plates they have. But older office buildings may lend themselves to commercial conversion. Strip malls, one-story buildings really aren't the best use of space and could be converted, but may not be a great option. The other option, which almost nobody has talked about in Connecticut, is subdividing existing large single-family homes into 2, 3, 4 unit complexes. So duplex, triplex, quadplex. According to us, our analysis here, those do pencil out and can deliver a pretty good rate of return. And in some cases, even do so when part of the complex is being deed restricted to qualify under 830G. I'm not aware of any municipalities that have programs in place to do that. If you go back to the middle of the last century, we saw a lot of old Victorian homes that were dated projects. dated products being converted into small apartment buildings. That could be an option for a municipality like New Canaan. Again, that's going to depend if there are willing property owners who want to carve up existing single-family homes into duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. That could, that could be controversial in some neighborhoods. It probably will come down to whether that building continues to blend into a neighborhood. We don't address this in our report, but there are good conversions and there are bad conversions. And the bad conversions have cut down all the trees, put parking all over the place, cause runoff problems, and have fire escapes, and probably have inadequate maintenance of the buildings. There are ways to address this through zoning. For instance, you could have a floating zone or a special permit, something that a density bonus that enables this. The details for that could be worked through, but it could be done in such a way that such a conversion is only permitted if it meets certain standards. Going back to the report, looking specifically at other options, ones that would qualify towards a moratorium with a 10%. Depending on where you are in the state, you'll probably explore different options. So if you're a rural community, most of the state, over 100 municipalities in Connecticut qualify as rural according to the USDA. And USDA mortgages, which can be zero down mortgages and are suitable products and have compelling interest rates. Unfortunately, they're not available in New Canaan, but every property owner who takes out a USDA mortgage counts towards 830G, even though the municipality in that case has done literally nothing. It was just the property buyer's choice to take out a USDA mortgage. There, you have about, I think, 2% of your affordable building stock is CHFA mortgages. Those do qualify. So you could look at working with either prospective buyers, real estate agents, or developers to push CHFA mortgages. That would potentially have no cost to the town. Looking at other options, we do recommend inclusionary zoning, but again, that's not going to, you're increasing the numerator and the denominator at the same time. So it's really not going to get you to moratorium any faster, unless the only alternate other scenario, if you don't have inclusionary zoning, is the entire project being built as market rate housing. So it's a good thing to do. It's not going to solve your problem. I think what you've done so far in New Canaan with funding 100% affordable housing through the municipality I'm not aware of any municipality in Connecticut that's done that. It is getting you much faster towards moratoriums than any other approach. One thing you could do, if you look at some of our analysis, we compared 80 and 60% of area and state median income to market rate rents. And the gap between what qualifies under 830G and what market rate is varies substantially by the unit type. So if you look at larger units, there's a bigger delta. If you look at smaller units, in much of the state, well, I should say in the region, because we look at the region specifically, the market rate is almost indistinguishable from the rate that could be charged under 830G for a rental. So one of our recommendations is that municipalities should consider working with property owners of existing older studio / efficiency and 1-bedroom apartments, and where possible, either leaving the owner in place and buying a deed restriction on that property, or if the owner is interested in selling, buying the property, deed restricting it, and flipping it back into the market. And that could be a relatively cost-effective way to increase the number of units that qualify under 830G. The nice thing about that is those units have depreciated, and they were built in an era when construction costs were substantially lower. So you're not paying for a new unit, and you're not paying the premium for construction today. We're not aware of any municipality that has a program to buy out existing units and deed restrict them, whether or not the property owners are left in place. But that could help chip away the numbers you need for a moratorium and get towards the 10%. With respect to the type of new development, we would consider New Canaan to be a center of town's urban fringe. And we generally recommend that you look at building smaller apartment buildings. So not duplex, triplexes, that's more in the outlying areas. But right in the center of town, it would be smaller apartment buildings and looking at 10 to 15% inclusionary zoning if you are letting the market develop. If you're focusing on 100% affordable, that's publicly funded, that's a separate conversation. We don't get into this.
Francis, when you say smaller apartment building, how many units are you thinking?
Well, it depends on the site, right? And
Right.
what the community appetite for that is, right? So it's more than 4 units. We're involved right now in a development. Westcog is in Stamford. We're supporting a 400 unit per acre development. It's 1,000 units total. That's obviously out of scale for New Canaan. So 30 units could be a reasonable size, 25, 40, 50. Smaller developments that would integrate nicely into the surrounding neighborhood. Obviously, parking could be an issue. Smaller units have lower parking requirements. And what we didn't look at it in this study, but in our previous regional affordable housing toolkit and our regional plan of conservation development, we identified a need for smaller units. We have a lot of larger homes in Connecticut, but we really haven't built starter homes. We haven't built 0, 1, and 2 bedroom homes in a long time. And so there probably is unmet demand for those. So in a nutshell, that's what our work found. We will be having a formal presentation at the July 18th COG meeting, which anybody can attend in person or remotely. That's next week at noon, given by Don Poland, who was the principal in the study.
Questions for Francis?
I have a question. It's
Mhm.
Chris. You mentioned in the study, regionalization plans, whether it's as simple as, housing association organizations to share best practices all the way to potential trusts that go across the region. Could you just touch on that and how you would see that working?
Yeah, so, well, there are a couple of related issues there. New Canaan has been a leader in its affordable housing trust fund in Connecticut. So I applaud you for that. If you look across the country, trust funds, they're not always called that, they're funded different ways. That is one of the principal means by which affordable housing is built. It's much more common nationally than it is in Connecticut. And it's generally operated at the state level or more often at the county level. And of course, we don't have county government in Connecticut. The challenge, I was just participating in a planning and zoning commission meeting for another municipality, a small one, and they are considering abolishing their affordable housing trust fund because they don't have enough money in it. They're a small town, right? So when you're a smaller community, it takes longer for the funds in to accrue to a point where you can actually realize a project. Now that is partly a function of size. It may also be a function of rate setting. It may also be a function of municipal expertise and the type of projects or concepts they develop, right? So if I need, let's say, I am collecting $100,000 a year, and the smallest project I can build is $2 million, that's going to take me 20 years, leaving aside interest and whatnot. If I am willing to use my affordable housing trust fund on an opportunistic basis, when I see a naturally occurring unit potentially coming up for sale and snap it up, deed restrict it, and resell it, then I could have a stream every year. I could potentially deplete those funds. Municipalities have largely been focusing on building projects themselves or working with developers to buy down new units, and that is a sporadic. Those developments are sporadic. So, especially for smaller municipalities, a regional approach could result in more projects getting built and not waiting for, built faster and not waiting for funds to accrue, and avoid these questions. What are we doing with this money? The other, in New Canaan's case, in a higher municipality where the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is bringing in more money because the rates are higher or the development costs are higher, so your percentage multiplied out brings in more money. that may not be such an issue. But one challenge we do see is that most municipalities are not developers, right? Most municipalities do not have large housing authorities that they run internally, have a lot of expertise building. And those larger authorities can, whether it's an authority or a private sector operator, the more you build, the lower your cost of building is going to be. You're going to develop institutional capacity, organizational knowledge, achieve economies of scale. Smaller towns trying to do one-offs can result in a really high cost per unit. And so one solution could be to have municipalities work together. And I know there's been discussion about expansion of housing authorities unilaterally. We're not advocating that, but municipalities could work together to learn from each other, either cooperate in building public housing and working provide more affordable housing on the private side too, or they could set up a regional entity, maybe not an authority that does that. So I'll give you an example. If you are looking to build housing and you're taking state funds, you will be under at least $1 million. You'll be bound by prevailing wage. Not to single this out, but there are ways to structure the deals you do where the cost structure that you face is not going to be that of prevailing wage, right? If you're building a public housing complex, odds are the municipality is paying higher hourly rates than the developer who is building mansions, right? So we're already starting way behind the gate relative to market rate private sector development. So there are ways to structure this so that we don't get tripped up by rules that might apply to a municipality that doesn't have expertise in doing this.
Francis, on the concept of a municipality buying naturally occurring affordable housing, deed restricting it, and either holding it and managing it or flipping it and putting it back out into the market. Do you foresee that happening by a municipal government, or do you think the municipal government needs to have create some other entity or recruit some other entity that actually handles that process? Because it feels like a lot for a town to take on.
Yeah, so there could be recriminations about perceived or real conflicts of interest. So that could absolutely be a problem. Also, development projects can take a couple years. When something, ideally, if you're looking at existing homes that are, relatively affordable or naturally occurring affordable housing, you don't want to wait for it to hit Zillow, right? Because, and no offense to the realtors in the room, but you're automatically adding 6% right there, right? I mean, the ideal thing that you would do, like we so often do, is you would work out a deal with the property owner where you say, people sell land all the time where it's a partial donation for open space, right? You work out favorable terms so that you're not paying what somebody in the market would pay. That can be a bit tricky, and you have to be able to respond quickly because it may be that somebody has entered a hospice and their wish is for their home to remain affordable. They may not have much time left. And if it goes to the heirs or probate court, everything may shift. So to be able to respond quickly could be very challenging. I can't imagine public meetings and hearings running this through efficiently because you may only have 30 days to make a decision. So I would suggest that this be run through some type of independent entity. And here's the other issue too, right? So if we're taking these units, they may need to be fixed up, right? Some of these units may be somewhat dilapidated, run down. They may have some health and safety violations or issues we need to address. Again, we don't want to get ourselves into a situation where we have to run it through a municipal procurement process or where we are bound by prevailing wage. It can really bog things down. So an independent entity, a nonprofit, probably do this if they had the sufficient scale, do this more efficiently than a municipality.
Is that a land trust? Is that a land banking? We've been looking at these various terms, what kind of an independent entity?
A land bank could do it. So land banks are usually, they usually are used either for brownfields where you have a cleanup that has to be done. And the brownfield land bank cleans it up and it returns the property to a state where it becomes desirable by the market. Or land bank buys up homes that are abandoned, extremely dilapidated, and brings them back to a marketable condition. In this case, in New Canaan, the homes are probably not that run down. So this would be a slightly different use of a land bank, but it would be an eligible use. The thing with such an approach is, of course, this depends on having willing sellers, right? So you can't really plan to get to, let's say you need 75 HUE points, or you need 150 units, whatever it is. You can't expect that you're going to find 150 willing sellers. This is, as I said, more opportunistic, where you're snapping things up if it's a good deal as they become available.
Mhm.
Really wonderful.
Anybody else? Um,
I should mention one other thing that you can't, if you are looking at getting towards a moratorium, again, I would recommend reviewing the statute very closely, but also the regulations in 830G. There are, I think Maria Weingarten alluded to it. There are rehabilitation options under there, where New Haven does this. They technically aren't subject to the affordable housing appeal process because they already have more than 10% housing that qualifies as affordable. Excuse me, but if you contribute at least $25,000 to the rehabilitation of a home that is affordable using your own definition of affordable, that would count towards 830G.
Does that count towards the 10% or the 3%?
The 10%.
The 10%, right? So
Yeah. That's
once you
important.
get to once you're getting to your your the home stretch, right? 10% is within sight, then you might want to have such a program.
And it's a 10-year programs, right? Something like, or you said, is it have to be 10 years?
Well,
Or you
so
could-
that's the thing. It's not a 10-year program. The way you could structure it is make it a 10-year for a loan that becomes
You'll have to rotate
it's
it.
forgiven, a forgivable loan, right? So essentially a grant if you stay in your home. So as long as that forgivable loan is in place, that property is still receiving the benefit. That's how you structure it. So it could be 5-year, it could be 15-year. 10 years, what New Haven does.
But 25,000, I mean, that's a bargain relative to spending $500,000 for one unit, right?
Mhm.
It's an so that's when we talk to municipalities about the USDA and CHAFA options, most of them say, what? You mean I can get points just by steering somebody to a certain lender? And yes, you can. But yeah, 25,000 a unit is an absolute bargain. But it's not, so for instance, you could say we have a lot of seniors in a municipality with fixed incomes. Their roofs are failing, their septics are failing, they have HVAC failures, plumbing, whatever. There are a lot of problems with their homes. We'd like to help them fix up their homes, and we'll have a municipal program to provide those resources to them, additional, them meeting our income standards. And as long as they stay in their home, then that loan would slowly be forgiven, and that would qualify under 830G or to 10%.
Anybody else for Francis?
And the only thing I'll add is it's a very tiny band of income
Yeah.
and home price
Yeah.
that we quickly max out on because we're New Canaan.
Yeah.
So
Which one is this, Maria?
for Chappa.
Yes, that is the challenge. That when you look at the purchase price limits, it is really
Except
hard. It's
federal
really
government.
hard to make them work. Now, if you are building, as I mentioned before, we have not built small homes in a long time in Connecticut for the most part, although we're seeing some change in the big cities in the last maybe 5 years. If you build really small units, you might hit those numbers because the purchase price limits are not based on square footage, they're based on bedrooms.
Thank you, very, really helpful.
Anybody else?
My pleasure,
Francis,
anytime.
Sorry.
Okay.
No, I didn't mean
Thank
to
you,
interrupt.
Francis.
Francis,
Take care.
Francis, real quick, I assume
Yeah.
the July 18th presentation will be recorded, right?
It will be recorded, we'll be posting on our website so that any planner, planning and zoning member or any member of the public can watch it.
Perfect.
Is
Okay.
that up in Ridgefield again?
That'll be at Ridgefield, 12 p.m. at the Town Hall Annex, 66 Prospector Street.
Okay. Thank you again. Take care of your puppy. Let him back in the room.
Thank you, have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night. Okay, item number 4, Project Development Subcommittee update and discussion with the committee. Krista.
So we had a meeting this evening at 5:30. Several of you were there. Almost everyone in this room was here in this exact spot. And we talked about 6 sites, potential sites. We each had taken one at the last meeting and did some homework and came back to talk about what we found out about each site. And I mean, I think the general takeaway was that all of them have viability. Yeah. Some of them have some bigger problems to surmount than others in terms of deed restrictions or acquiring land property from the state. So anyway, we're making progress on what I would call the big ball approach in terms of where we could put a larger quantity of units on a single site. Some of the sites are smaller than others too. So for instance, Morse Court is not going to have 75 units on it unless we're building a skyscraper, which I
Well,
don't think we're doing.
Richmond Hill fit that bill too, the way you had talked about it, the way you analyzed it.
Yeah, so,
Manageable number of units.
yeah, so anyway, they range from the mulch pile, which is what, 50 acres. We're not talking about developing 50 acres, but a big site all the way down to, I don't remember, I mean, like half acre or less for some of the in-town ones. So we're going to continue refining our research on that. We're going to look to engage with an architect or real estate developer to help us start to really put some numbers in terms of how many units could we fit, theoretically, how much money would it cost, those types of things, so that we have some real data to present to the public in terms of pros and cons for the potential options. And our next meeting is August 19th at 6 p.m. Probably in this room, but I don't know that yet.
Okay, any other thoughts, Project Committee?
I will
Okay.
also, I'll just add, we didn't get to it tonight, but I have spent some time thinking about small ball and how we could approach it. And certainly some of the conversations we had this evening also play into that. So that will be at future meetings. We'll have those conversations.
Yeah, it seems to me some of the small ball strategies they're real, they're out there. You know, the challenge is, okay, who are the experts who help you execute on the strategies?
Yeah. Well, I have some thoughts on that too, but I'll wait until we get to speakers.
Okay. Chris Wilson, do we still have you? I know I think you had a hard stop. Is Chris still there? I think we lost Chris. Okay. Financing Subcommittee, I think the last one was canceled, so we'll just skip items 5. So speakers, speaking of Krista,
Oh, all right.
we'll start with Jane, but I think you have stuff to say. But
Yeah.
item number 6, discussion of future speakers, Jane Williams.
Okay, so August meeting, we know that Rick Redness, a number of you recommended him. He will be coming. He's from Stanford, I believe an engineer in background, but apparently an expert in affordable housing. So he will be here. The second thing we've talked about, and this, Krista and I have had a conversation about this, so please chime in, Krista, and actually Maria as well, are strategies for small ball and whether we want to look into a little more detail on that, John, in August. It's interesting that Francis said land banking, because that's one of the things we've been sort of swirling around, is what the heck are these definitions and what entity could that be? And also Maria has a suggestion somebody who's been on our list for a while, Danielle Dobin,
Mhm.
who might be able to talk about, she was P and Z chair in Westport, all probably know that, but could talk about the cottage cluster, the small house,
Okay.
small ball contract. So that's a possibility. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that right now. And does that make sense to be the whole committee, small ball conversation, or project committee, or how do you guys?
To me, it makes sense, I think, for it to be the whole committee because we're gonna have to figure out how to finance it. We're gonna have to figure out where the sites are. So it's kind of like a bigger strategy thing that, you know, if we choose to go that direction.
And Danielle could also talk about how hard it was or easy it was to get money from this, not money, land from
Land.
the state.
Yeah. So we'll look for a land bank person, as well, and see if she can do things.
Who's
One
the
other
land
thing,
bank?
sorry?
When you say we'll look for a land banking person.
Yeah, you had said that, maybe Mike was telling New Haven?
New Haven, yeah, so I was looking in preparation for the subcommittee meeting at, you know, who could this entity be that acquires land and recycles it with deed restrictions for the town, because as Francis pointed out, government is not a quick actor in the marketplace, and therefore it doesn't really make sense for the government to do that. And so in researching it, I mean, there's basically two paths we can go down, and I think we probably should explore both of them at this point in time. One is creating, I guess, what would be called a land bank. And there's only a few of those in the state of Connecticut so far. New Haven, I think, would probably be the closest one. They recently, like as of last year, created the New Haven Land Bank Authority. And they're using it to buy, might be the wrong with it. They are buying land, but a lot of it in their case is tax delinquent, abandoned, blighted, that they want to recycle and get back, you know, maybe assemble and get back into the marketplace. Ours would be a little different. I don't think we have that many tax foreclosed or blighted properties that we're trying to acquire, but I think we would have a more targeted view. So that's sort of the public sector approach, is this land bank, and there is enabling legislation at the state level for that type of thing. I don't know if it makes sense in a community as small. I mean, New Haven, Hartford, bigger places, bigger problems. This may make sense. I don't know if it makes sense in a New Canaan. The other option is a community land trust. And those are nonprofit entities that also get into affordable housing. They can get into land acquisition and hold it. They can, sometimes they build, sometimes they rehab and redevelop. Sometimes they continue to hold the properties and manage them long-term. Sometimes they flip them and get them back in the market. And I don't have it with me, but I found a handout somewhere that there's 7 community land trusts in the state of Connecticut, and the closest one looked like it was in Washington. So I was thinking we could, anyway, my thoughts were we could reach out to New Haven Land Bank and the Washington Land Trust and see if we could get anyone to speak to us from either of those places, so that we could kind of evaluate the two options between going public sector or private sector in terms of how that would get handled and how complicated and hard it is.
Well, how is a community land trust like the one in Washington different from the land trust that we have indicated?
Well, that's what's so, it's the verbiage, it's everybody's.
So the
using same
community
words, but
land
they're very
trust
different things.
in Washington, and the 7 that I'm speaking of around the state have an affordable housing focus. The one that we talk about in New Canaan is an open space focus.
But the law, the state statute that allows you to put money in somewhere to acquire land talks about affordable housing and open space. So I'm just wondering would it be as complicated, or would it just be expanding the scope of the land trust to say we're gonna share this if we were to allocate funds towards it? I'm just trying to think of ways to do this that's
to do it
simpler
quicker,
and
yeah.
like where we're not
Creating,
creating a whole new entity
Yeah.
where we already have one that complies with the statute that could do this function legally. We would have to probably look at whatever.
I mean, it's a pretty big mission shift. That's the only thing I would say. I mean,
No,
it's-
I don't think, I'm just saying like there is a bank account that exists. That's a land trust that's allowed under the statute. And so it can.
you're
be
just
used
talking
for
about the
open
money. You're not
space.
talking about our
I mean, maybe
nonprofit.
there's I'm just trying to think of ways to be efficient about it. Like if we already have something that exists under the state statute and it could be
Right.
used for either, but they have to apply this, I don't know.
So
how
you're talking about our open space acquisition
Yeah.
fund?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I thought you were talking about the New Canaan Land
I'm
Trust.
talking
which
about
is-
both, kind of.
Okay, well, the New Canaan Land Trust is a nonprofit entity that
Yes.
focuses on preserving open space. So to ask, I mean, I'm not saying we could ask them if they want to get in the business of also preserving affordable housing, but that's a
No,
pretty
I'm
big
saying
mission
the account-
shift.
No, but like whoever manages that account, like Chris Shipper from the land trust would come to us and ask for allocations
Right.
from that open space
No, I think the
account.
money.
But
is not-
under the law, he's not entitled to 100% of it. The
Right.
land trust is not entitled. So I'm just trying to think of like, because the statute would allow that money to be used, not just for, whatever the land trust mission is right now, but that money should be able to be used for
I agree.
affordable housing. So I'm just thinking how technical do we need to get? How many more authorities
But
do we have
someone has to
name?
buy it.
No, I totally
Yeah,
get
so I mean,
that.
there's the money piece and then there's the who actually goes out and
Function.
Yeah.
Says, I found this property.
I found this property, I'm gonna put my name on the deed, I can
Yeah.
buy it next week,
Yeah,
The housing authority is a nonprofit I mean, you're not for-profit, government?
When we've talked about this, about going out and,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
looking for properties coming on the market, but it was always the management problem that kind of stopped us, that we're kind of at our limits, just kind of managing what we
Right.
have with all the problems, and it's all confined, but if we had, 2 units here and 5 units here, so we kind of shied away from that, but we could do it.
Okay,
Just trying to, like,
but legally they
reduce
could do it, but I mean, so
bureaucracy.
it's,
Yeah,
it's a matter of staffing then. It's
Yeah.
a matter of
Yeah.
resources towards the housing authority. I mean, and we'd have to consider those options, like, does it make sense to create a whole new entity, or do we just want to beef up
Totally.
the one that exists?
And maybe what we could do in short term is do a little more research, find out, talk to these folks, Krista, and figure out, what's their advice if we already have existing structure.
Yeah, like, and why
Does that
didn't
make
they,
sense?
why did
Why
they
didn't they
choose
do
not
that?
to use their
Yeah,
land?
that's my
Their
question.
housing
really, is,
authority.
do they have a separate, is
Okay.
this totally separate focused on? That,
Yeah.
and maybe that's something we pull from the housing authority, maybe we create a separate management authority. That, so like you can focus on development and then we have a separate entity that focuses on.
Because currently the housing, there's no staff. It's,
Right,
Yeah.
it's all
Yeah.
volunteer.
It's all volunteer, and
Yeah.
we have a great management company, that does the management part, and they're actually very helpful to us, and McCarthy was very helpful to us too, that used to cross over the membrane a little bit and help us on like acquisition stuff. But we don't have any staff.
Yeah, which is, I don't think we'll ever have a staff either. We have to figure out, we identify these strategies and then how do you subcontract those out?
Right.
That's the only way,
Job for the first
unless we go to
one.
the town, we say, okay, we need 2 head count. Good luck.
Yeah.
But I'd be curious how the community land trust is structured, whether it's under the same enabling statute as the land trust account that we have, it might be separate. There might be something.
I don't think you need an enabling statute to create a community land trust for affordable housing. I mean, if they want money from the municipality, the
Yeah.
municipality have to have this account that you're speaking of,
Yeah.
but I could start a nonprofit tomorrow and
Sure.
call it the New Canaan New Affordable Housing Land Trust.
Yeah. I'm
Okay,
curious.
we'll work on it.
2 other quick things, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Just, we had also talked about the Habitat for Humanity
Mhm.
small ball possibility, and Rich Townsend, who will be coming, needs a little more time, so he'll probably be here in September.
Okay.
And the other thing was, and maybe this is gonna be next on the agenda, but process on the public event and how can we help and.
Yeah, so, one idea was to, as we talked about, was to use Glenn Chowder as a vehicle. We had a great discussion with Glenn, but Glenn is in the process of retiring. And so this project, I outlined the project we talked to him about, and it's too big for him. So we need to work on the next Glenn Chowder.
John, I'm gonna sign off. I've, was hoping we'd be finished by now.
Okay, Bill, have a good night.
Thanks all.
Take care. Yeah.
To see
Yeah,
like
I tried to twist,
mentee
I
or-
tried, I
Yeah.
tried to twist his arm. He gave me one, he gave a person at Fairfield, I think myself included, we all need to just keep networking. And he gave me a name to network, which I need to work on, and there's a couple of others. And yeah, I think one of the things we need to do, and, speaking to the Rick Rednesses of the world, et cetera, is just need to, network. I think the interesting thing is that the financing side, the way I think about this, is a less of a challenge because, you have the David McCarthy's of the world. I think we have a hold on a lot of that. But it's the actual, how do we as a small town, which is, by tradition's the wrong word, but we tend to have small head counts in town. And so I think we have to think about, identifying our goals, identifying strategies, but then we also have to identify, of course, this will all be recommendations, like we're not making a decision, blah, blah, blah. But how do we identify how to contract this stuff out? Okay, public comments. Anybody in the room like to comment? Nope. Okay, thank you. Anybody on Zoom? Okay, do I motion for adjournment? Okay, Maria moved it and Jane seconded. Thank you, guys. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I get Steve's phone number? I had
absolutely.
a in the weeds question for him. I wasn't gonna bore everybody with my in the.
Maria, I don't